Imagine a man who smiles at his neighbors every morning, who waves politely as he drives his children to school, who posts pictures of family vacations and backyard barbecues. He looks like the perfect husband, the devoted father, the man next door. But behind the closed doors of that same suburban home, something darker is building. And one day, without warning, he destroys everything he was supposed to protect. A criminological and psychological autopsy of patriarchal familicide. And before you turn away, remember, these men were not strangers from a far-off underworld. They were fathers, husbands, neighbors, the people you thought you could trust. On a cold November morning in 1971, John List prepared a sandwich after killing his wife and mother, waiting calmly for his children to come home so he could shoot them, one by one. In 2018, Chris Watts loaded the bodies of his pregnant wife and 2 daughters into his work truck, then stood on television begging for their return. And in 2002, Scott Peterson told the world he was fishing on Christmas Eve, while his pregnant wife vanished forever. How could the family man, the cultural symbol of love and security, become the destroyer of his own family? That is the paradox we must confront. Don't look away, because the truth behind these crimes will force you to question what you think you know about fatherhood, masculinity, and the safety of the home itself. In most cases of familicide, the killer does not see himself as a murderer. He sees himself as a savior, a man delivering his family from shame, from ruin, from a future he can no longer bear. He believes he is rescuing them, even as he annihilates them. But in reality, these crimes are not about mercy. They are about control, narcissism, and the unbearable collapse of a fragile male ego. The protector becomes the executioner. The man next door becomes the annihilator. Stay with us, because the story you're about to hear will change how you look at the people you think you know best. The Annihilator Next Door, a criminological and psychological autopsy of patriarchal familicide. Say it out loud once. Let the words sit in the room. The idea sounds clinical. The reality is not. It is bedrooms. It is breakfast tables. It is the photo on the mantle that will never be updated again. We begin with the figure society celebrates. The family man, provider, guide, guardian. He promises safety. He performs normal. He collects symbols of stability, a mortgage, a wedding ring, a school drop-off routine. The mask is convincing because the role is familiar. Neighbors wave, colleagues approve. The costume fits. Under that costume sits pressure, the kind that does not show up in a police report until it is too late. Shame over money, fear of status loss, an affair that threatens a reputation built on control, a wife who wants to leave, children who grow into their own wills. The story is not about sudden madness. It is about a long negotiation inside a very rigid mind. What am I if I am not the man in charge? What remains of me if people see me fail? Criminology gives us a map. Familicide is not serial murder. It is not a public rampage. It is an attack on the family unit by its own patriarch in a single event. Researchers describe recurring motives. Revenge disguised as righteousness. Disappointment hardened into judgment. Economic collapse that erases identity. Paranoid rescue fantasies that call murder mercy. None of these motives excuse the act. They only reveal the story a perpetrator tells himself so he can cross an unthinkable line. The culture supplies the stage. The home is private. The walls keep secrets. The legend of the strong father asks a man to carry the burden alone and never confess fear. When the job is lost, he pretends to commute. When the marriage breaks, he pretends to reconcile. When the debt climbs, he pretends to manage. Each pretense adds weight. Each lie narrows the path. Control becomes the only relief he can imagine. The names that follow are familiar because they shattered that legend. John List in New Jersey, an accountant, a churchgoer. Order was his creed. When his financial order collapsed, he planned a solution that preserved his image and removed his problem. He wrote a letter that called murder salvation. He walked away and built a second life. The mask did not slip. He replaced it. Christopher Watts in Colorado, the digital age annihilator. Smiles on video, family announcements online, a second life off camera. When the two narratives collided, he chose erasure. He hid behind a porch plea and a false story that blamed the dead. His words were calm, his actions were not. The gap between public image and private choice became a chasm you could see on a television screen. Scott Peterson in California. A case built without a confession, a story told through behavior and timing, a secret relationship, a fishing alibi. Bodies recovered where currents could carry them. A courtroom turned into a stage for national judgment. The lesson is not only legal, it is cultural. Demeanor can blind us. We expect grief to look a certain way. When it does not, we fill in the blanks. Across these stories, one theme repeats: possession. The family is no longer a set of people with independent needs and futures. It becomes a project, a brand, a proof of worth. When the project fails, the owner eliminates the evidence of failure. This is the most chilling idea in this entire field. Love becomes management. Care becomes control. The house becomes a container. The people inside become parts. Listen to the language offenders use. Save, protect, end the suffering, end the shame. The verbs sound kind. The logic is not. It is a logic of totality. If I cannot have my life as designed, then no version of that life will remain. If I must start over, then nothing that marks the old life will survive. It is not rage alone. It is a decision. Now widen the frame. Media changes the texture of these crimes. In one era, a clay bust on a television show brings a fugitive to justice. In another era, body camera footage and interrogation videos reach millions in days. The audience becomes part of the narrative. Threads of analysis, theories and comments, grief turned into content. Transparency helps catch lies. It can also create noise that drowns out context. We will not sensationalize. The victims were not symbols. They were people who loved and were loved. They had schedules, a doctor appointment, a soccer game, a return flight that landed after midnight, a holiday meal that never happened. The scale of the loss is measured in small details. A lunchbox left in a sink, a coat on a hook, a room that stays the same year after year. One more truth before we move forward. Many family annihilators do not plan to die. They plan to continue. They plead. They run. They build a second identity. They study how to sound innocent. This separates rescue fantasy from reality. If mercy were the motive, the act would end with the actor. Instead, we see self-preservation. We see a man who kills the part of his life that exposes him and then tries to live unburdened. Hold that in your mind as we begin. The Annihilator Next Door, a criminological and psychological autopsy of patriarchal familicide. This is not a tale about monsters from the margins. It is about ordinary rooms and ordinary routines that hide extraordinary danger. And here is the detail you should not miss. Somewhere in every timeline, there was a moment when intervention was possible. Someone saw control. Someone heard contempt. Someone felt fear and could not name it. The next chapter will trace the fault lines before they broke. Pay attention to the small signals, because under the perfect photograph, the crack had already formed, and it was growing. The Annihilator Next Door, a criminological and psychological autopsy of patriarchal familicide. Before a family is destroyed in one night, cracks appear. They are rarely hidden to everyone. They are whispered in texts, muttered in arguments, carried in late-night phone calls to friends. Yet so often, they are not recognized as warning signs until it is too late. Look at John List. Outwardly, he was the accountant, the devout Lutheran, the man who moved his family into a grand New Jersey mansion. But under the facade, his world was collapsing. He had lost his job. He spent days pretending to commute, sitting at train stations reading newspapers so his family would not know. Bills piled high. His wife struggled with illness and alcoholism. His daughter dreamed of acting, a career he judged sinful. To neighbors, the house looked stately. Inside, silence and disapproval ruled. The crack was there. His inability to admit failure, his fear of humiliation greater than his love for his family. Christopher Watts told a different story online. His wife Shanann filled social media with videos of smiling children, birthday parties, announcements of a new baby boy named Nico. The image was curated, polished, enviable. But behind that digital glow, Chris was withdrawing. He avoided Shanann's touch. He spent nights texting his coworker and mistress. He searched online for relationship getaways and jewelry, not for his wife, but for another woman. Shanann sensed it. She wrote to friends, "He said we are not compatible anymore. He refused to hug me." These were not vague suspicions. They were real alarms. But in the curated world of Facebook Lives and MLM promotions, the facade looked intact. Scott Peterson carried his own quiet duplicity. Lassie, 8 months pregnant, decorated their Modesto home for Christmas. Neighbors saw warmth and anticipation, but Scott was calling Amber Frey, telling her he was a widower, constructing a fantasy where his obligations did not exist. He purchased a small fishing boat just weeks before Lacey vanished. To friends, the boat seemed odd, a hobby acquired suddenly. To investigators later, it became a possible disposal method. The cracks were there. Secret lies, unexplained purchases, a mask of calm that felt wrong in moments of crisis. These men shared a psychological script. Each was over-enmeshed with the idea of control. The family was not a set of people, but a mirror of the self. When that mirror reflected failure, defiance, or exposure, it became intolerable. Research shows narcissism, shame, and patriarchal entitlement form a toxic triad. Narcissism demands admiration. Shame whispers failure. Entitlement insists obedience. When these collide, the result can be catastrophic. What makes the cracks terrifying is their ordinary disguise. Losing a job is common. Marital strain is common. Affairs are tragically common, but in certain minds, these pressures are not setbacks. They are existential threats. The man who defines himself only as provider or patriarch cannot tolerate collapse. And so he begins to see his family not as companions in hardship, but as evidence of his failure. Could these tragedies have been prevented if someone had seen the cracks clearly? Could intervention, financial counseling, mental health support, domestic violence safeguards have shifted the trajectory? Or were these men already locked into a worldview where the only answer was annihilation? John List left a letter blaming evil in the world and claiming he saved souls. Chris Watts, in his first false confession, accused Shanann of killing their daughters, shifting guilt onto the woman he had silenced. Scott Peterson, even after conviction, insisted he was innocent, never acknowledging guilt. Each man refused to bear responsibility. Each looked outward, never inward. That refusal itself was a crack, a deep fracture in empathy and accountability. Think of the images that survive. List's mansion standing empty, bodies inside for a month. Watts on his porch, arms crossed, speaking calmly to cameras as his children lay hidden in oil tanks. Peterson in interviews, too relaxed, too controlled, failing to perform the grief the public demanded. These are not just images of killers. They are portraits of cracks made visible, moments when the mask slipped and the emptiness underneath showed itself. What is the cost of ignoring small signals? A neighbor who says something felt off. One wife who texts, "He refused to hug me." A sudden, unexplained purchase. Are these harmless quirks, or are they whispers of a deeper fracture? If someone had listened, if someone had acted, could entire families have been spared? The cracks that appear while there is still time to act. The annihilator next door. A criminological and psychological autopsy of patriarchal familicide. The cracks had been there for months, even years, but the tragedy arrives in hours. It comes suddenly, yet it is the product of long brewing storms. This is the moment when the protector becomes the destroyer. November 9, 1971, Westfield, New Jersey. John List begins the morning like any other. He reads the newspaper. He carries out quiet tasks. But by midday, his house is a mausoleum. His wife, Helen, is shot in the kitchen. His mother, Alma, is killed upstairs. He waits for his children, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. Each one he greets with calm precision, then executes. When the last shot is fired, he lines their bodies on sleeping bags in the ballroom. He eats lunch. He finishes chores. He tunes a radio to a religious station, lowers the thermostat, and walks away. The house stands silent for nearly a month before the truth emerges. 5 bodies, 5 lives gone, and a father who vanished into thin air. August 13, 2018, Frederick, Colorado. Shanann Watts returns home from a late business trip. She is 15 weeks pregnant with her 3rd child. Surveillance shows her friend dropping her off at 1:48 a.m. Inside the home, Chris Watts is awake. Hours later, Shanann is dead, strangled in her own bed. Their daughters Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3, are smothered. Chris loads their bodies into his truck, drives to an oil field, buries Shanann in a shallow grave, and drops his daughters into crude oil tanks. By dawn, he is at work. By evening, he is on his porch, arms folded, pleading for their safe return on national television. But the house already carries an unbearable silence, and the cameras capture a man hiding in plain sight. December 24, 2002, Modesto, California. It is Christmas Eve. Lassie Peterson, 8 months pregnant, disappears. Her dog is found wandering the neighborhood, leash still attached. Scott Peterson tells police he was fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina. For weeks, the search grips the nation. Posters, vigils, television cameras follow every development. Then in April, the bodies of Lacey and her unborn son wash ashore in the San Francisco Bay. Scott is arrested. His hair is dyed blonde. He carries thousands in cash and his brother's passport. The trial that follows will divide America, but the tragedy is already written. A young woman and her unborn child erased, a family destroyed on the night meant for celebration. These nights are the breaking point, but they are also moments of chilling calculation. John List planned his massacre for weeks, crafting cover stories, canceling deliveries, cutting himself out of family photos. Chris Watts rehearsed the lie, telling co-workers he wanted a divorce, telling his mistress he was free, even searching online for ways to cause a miscarriage before resorting to murder. Scott Peterson bought a boat, made anchors, and built an alibi with the confidence of a man who thought he could outmaneuver the truth. And then there is the twist that haunts every witness. In Watts's final confession, he admits his daughters were alive when he loaded them into his truck. Bella asked, "What are you doing with Mommy?" Hours later, as she watched him smother her sister, she begged, "Please, Daddy, don't do to me what you just did to Cece. Safaridum." Her words are the most searing evidence of what this crime really is. Not a sudden snap, not a mercy, but a deliberate act of annihilation against the most defenseless voices in the world. The public recoils because the contradiction is unbearable. A father's arms should shield. A husband's vow should protect. Instead, the arms strangle. The vow is broken. The home turns to a tomb. This inversion, the protector turned executioner, is why society cannot look away. It is horror and fascination bound together. Each tragedy has its own signature. List chose the cold efficiency of a gun. Watts used his bare hands, the most intimate and brutal method. Peterson's case remains debated, the method undetermined, but the bodies tell the outcome. Different tools, same result. A family erased by the man meant to sustain it. In every case, the facade continues for a moment longer. List walked away and built a new life as Robert Clark. Watts smiled into cameras and told lies until a failed polygraph stripped him bare. Peterson maintained calm, telling Amber Frey he had lost his wife long before the truth came out. They killed, and then they tried to live. That is perhaps the darkest twist of all. The tragedy is not only the murders, it is the betrayal of trust, the destruction of innocence, and the ripple of grief that spreads outward. Friends, neighbors, entire communities asking the same question. How could this happen here, with him, with them? The annihilator next door. The tragedy of patriarchal familicide is not only about death, it is about the shattering of the story we tell ourselves. That home is safe, that fatherhood is sacred, that love protects. But in these cases, home became a crime scene. Fatherhood became domination. Love became control. And in a single night, the cracks split wide open into irreversible ruin. The annihilator next door. A criminological and psychological autopsy of patriarchal familicide. The tragedy is only the first act. What follows is a second stage, played out in courtrooms, news broadcasts, and living rooms across the country. If the murders shattered the private sphere, the trials exposed the cracks in public. For John List, justice was delayed nearly 2 decades. After walking out of his Westfield mansion in 1971, he built a new identity. Robert Clark, quiet accountant, church member, husband once again. For 18 years, he lived undisturbed, a ghost hiding in daylight. It was not until America's Most Wanted aired his story, complete with an eerily accurate clay bust of his aged face, that a neighbor recognized him. Arrested in 1989, List finally stood trial. The courtroom was stunned by his 5-page letter to his pastor, where he claimed he had saved his family from spiritual ruin. The prosecution painted him as a cold planner, not a desperate father. The jury agreed. Life sentences, one for each life he had taken. In prison, he spoke of remorse, yet insisted he had done what was necessary. Even in judgment, he clung to his twisted narrative. Christopher Watts' path to trial was far shorter, but the fallout was equally explosive. After his porch interviews and false stories collapsed under the weight of a failed polygraph, Watts confessed, first partially, then fully. His televised plea now looks like theater, a chilling performance dissected frame by frame on social media. Prosecutors presented the contrast: the smiling father online, the killer who buried his family at work. Facing overwhelming evidence, Watts accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. Life without parole, stacked sentences ensuring he would never leave prison walls. The judge called the crime the most inhumane and vicious he had ever seen. For the public, the fallout continued long after sentencing. Hours of police bodycam footage, interrogation videos, and text messages were released, fueling a digital autopsy conducted by millions of viewers. Watts became not only a criminal but a case study, analyzed endlessly by strangers around the world. Scott Peterson's story turned into a cultural battle. Unlike Lister Watts, he never confessed. His conviction rested almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. The affair with Amber Fry, the fishing trip alibi, the bodies washing ashore near where he had been. Prosecution built a powerful story, a man seeking freedom from marriage and fatherhood, willing to kill to achieve it. The defense argued the state had tunnel vision, ignoring other suspects and building a case from inference, not proof. In the courtroom, demeanor became evidence. Jurors and spectators watched Peterson's calmness, his casual calls with Amber, his lack of visible grief. To many, he looked guilty before the verdict was read. When the jury sentenced him to death in 2005, crowds outside the courthouse cheered. Yet the fallout continued for years. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, citing errors in jury selection. His conviction stood, but his fate shifted to life without parole. Debate lingers. Was Scott Peterson condemned by evidence or by the image of a cheating husband who did not act like a grieving widower? Each trial revealed not just guilt or innocence, but society's hunger for answers. People needed to believe there was a way to read the signs, to see the mask slip before it was too late. Media coverage amplified this hunger. For List, television caught him. For Peterson, television may have condemned him. For Watts, digital media turned his life into an open-source case file. And yet behind every headline, families mourned. Children without grandparents, parents without daughters, communities scarred by the realization that evil lived next door. The legal system delivers a verdict, but the cultural trial never ends. We revisit the interviews. We dissect the letters. We debate whether the punishment fits the crime. The killers live on in documentaries, podcasts, dramatizations. The victims live on in framed photographs, in the memory of what might have been. What most people forget is that none of these men took their own lives. They planned to continue. They imagined a future after annihilation. That detail changes everything. These were not crimes of despair ending in self-destruction. They were acts of selfish preservation, followed by attempts to rewrite the story. The fallout reminds us that justice is not only about prison walls. It is about the questions left behind. Could this have been prevented? Did the media help or harm? Are we safer for knowing or just more haunted? The trial convicts the man. The fallout convicts the myth. The belief that the man next door could never do such a thing.